What would you do if you saw someone in desperate need and everyone else just walked by? This is the story of Andrew, a 12-year-old homeless boy with nothing to his name but his courage, and a billionaire family whose lives are forever changed by his selfless act. When a chance encounter brings their worlds crashing together, it sparks a journey of transformation, sacrifice, and hope that will leave you questioning what truly matters in life. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a moment of this emotional and inspiring story. Join us as we explore how one act of kindness can ripple through lives and reshape destinies. Now let's dive into the story of a boy who had nothing to give, but gave everything. Homeless boy saves billionaire's pregnant wife what he asked. For in return made the millionaire cry. The sun blazed mercilessly over the city streets, reflecting off the asphalt in waves of shimmering heat. Andrew crouched in the sliver of shade cast by a towering brick building, clutching his knees to his chest. His tattered sneakers, once white, were now streaked with grime, and his grey t-shirt clung to his back, soaked with sweat. It was the kind of summer day where even breathing felt like an effort, the air heavy with humidity and the smell of hot concrete. At just 12 years old, Andrew moved with the instincts of someone far older, sharpened by years of survival. His eyes darted around, scanning the bustling street for opportunities, an unattended water bottle, a bakery where leftovers might be thrown out, or a fountain to quench his thirst. The streets teemed with people, but to Andrew, they were faceless. No one looked down, no one saw him. Andrew's stomach growled as he trudged toward the public park, where a fountain stood among the withering grass and drooping trees. The heat had driven most people indoors, but the park still held a few souls like him, people seeking solace from the city's relentless summer. Among them was Charlie, a wiry man in his 50s with a weathered face and an old army jacket. Charlie had claimed a bench under a dying oak tree, his head tilted back, mouth slightly open as he dozed in the shade. "Andrew!" a voice called, hoarse but warm. A woman named Miss Maggie waved him over. She was sitting cross-legged on a patch of grass, her frayed sundress billowing slightly in the faint breeze. Miss Maggie had once been a teacher, Andrew had heard before. Life had swallowed her whole. She smiled at him, though her eyes were sunken and tired. "Find anything good today?" she asked, nodding toward the crumpled paper bag Andrew carried. "Not much," Andrew replied, sitting down beside her. He opened the bag, revealing a few stale bagels he'd scavenged from a dumpster behind a cafe. "You can have one if you want." Miss Maggie hesitated, but eventually took a bagel, breaking off a small piece. "You're too kind, kid," she said softly. "You shouldn't have to share. You barely get enough for yourself." Andrew shrugged. It's not right to keep it all when someone else needs it. As the day dragged on, Andrew's mind wandered back to a time when life was different, a time when the heat of summer meant ice cream cones on the porch, sprinklers in the backyard, and laughter echoing through his home. Those memories felt like fragments of a dream, blurred and distant. It had all changed 2 years ago, on a rainy autumn evening. A car accident took his parents away in an instant, leaving Andrew adrift in a system that promised care, but delivered pain. Foster homes, with their cold walls and colder hearts, had been no refuge. He ran when the fear of staying became greater than the fear of the streets. Andrew wiped the sweat from his brow and leaned back against the building. The shade was shrinking as the sun shifted, forcing him to move. He stood, stretching his sore limbs, and surveyed the street. That was when he saw her. A woman, visibly pregnant, was stumbling along the sidewalk. She clutched a paper bag in one hand, the other bracing her swollen belly. Her face was flushed, her hair matted against her forehead with sweat. Her steps were unsteady, her body swaying as if she might collapse at any moment. Andrew's instincts kicked in. He stepped forward, then hesitated. People were passing her by, pretending not to notice. A man in a crisp suit glanced her way and then quickly averted his eyes. A woman pushing a stroller crossed the street to avoid her. Andrew felt a pang of anger, but swallowed it down. The woman staggered again, and this time her knees buckled. She collapsed onto the pavement, the paper bag spilling its contents, a bottle of water, an apple, a small loaf of bread. Andrew didn't think twice. He ran to her. "Mum, are you okay?" Andrew crouched beside her, his voice steady despite the knot of panic tightening in his chest. The woman looked up at him, her face contorted in pain. I think," she gasped, her hand clutching her belly. "I need help." Andrew glanced around, his eyes scanning the street for someone, anyone who might step in. But the crowd moved on, oblivious or uncaring. He turned back to the woman, his heart pounding. "Don't worry," he said, his voice firmer now. "I'll figure something out." He reached for the bottle of water that had rolled out of her bag, twisted the cap off, and gently held it to her lips. "Drink a little," he urged. "It'll help." The woman took a small sip, her breathing uneven. Andrew stayed by her side, his mind racing. The nearest payphone was several blocks away. If he left her, she might not be here when he got back. But staying here, doing nothing, wasn't an option either. Andrew made his decision. "Stay here," he said, his tone as commanding as a boy of 12 could muster. "I'll be right back." He stood, his legs trembling slightly, and bolted down. The street. The sun bore down on him, the heat making the asphalt feel like it might melt under his feet. But Andrew didn't stop. The midday sun blazed overhead, unrelenting in its intensity. The sidewalk radiated heat, creating ripples in the air that distorted the figures of those who walked by. Laura, her hands clutching her swollen belly, stumbled forward. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her face flushed and streaked with sweat. She paused, bracing herself against a lamppost, but her legs buckled under her. The paper bag in her hand slipped, scattering its contents across the pavement as she collapsed. People on the street glanced at her briefly, then turned away, their faces carefully neutral. A businessman, talking animatedly on his phone, sidestepped her as though she were an obstacle rather than a person in need. A woman pushing a stroller hurriedly crossed to the other side of the road. It was as if Laura had become invisible. Andrew had just reached the payphone when he heard the faint thud of Laura hitting the ground. He turned, his sharp instincts kicking in. There she was, lying motionless, her hair damp and matted against her forehead. He didn't hesitate. Sprinting back toward her, Andrew dropped to his knees beside the woman. Her eyes fluttered open briefly, and she moaned softly, clutching her belly. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Andrew asked, his voice firm but laced with concern. She didn't respond, only letting out another pained gasp. Andrew scanned the street, raising his voice. "Somebody help! Please!" A man in sunglasses glanced over, hesitated, then hurried off. Andrew clenched his jaw in frustration. He'd seen it too many times before, the way people averted their eyes, the way they pretended not to see. Turning his attention back to Laura, Andrew quickly assessed the situation. She was clearly dehydrated. Her cracked lips and flushed cheeks made that obvious. Her breaths were shallow, and the way her hand clutched her belly told him something was wrong with her pregnancy. He reached for the water bottle that had rolled out of her bag and twisted off the cap. "Here, drink this," he said gently. Tilting the bottle to her lips, Laura took a small sip, coughing slightly as the cool liquid hit her throat. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The heat bore down on Andrew as he draped his tattered shirt over her face and shoulders to block the sun. His mind raced, trying to think of what to do next. He called out again, his voice hoarse from shouting, "Help! This woman needs help!" A man passing by finally stopped, looking uncomfortable. "What's going on?" "She's pregnant, and she collapsed," Andrew explained quickly. "Can you call an ambulance?" The man hesitated, fumbled with his phone, then muttered, "Sorry, I'm late for a meeting," before walking away. Andrew's heart sank, but he refused to give up. He gently squeezed Laura's shoulder. "I'm going to get help, okay? Just hold on." "No, don't leave," Laura murmured weakly, her hand clutching his arm. Andrew hesitated. If he stayed, there was nothing he could do but watch her condition worsen. If he left, even for a moment, he feared what might happen. Steeling himself, he gently pried her fingers from his arm. "I'll be right back, I promise," he said, his voice firm. Andrew took off down the street, his sneakers slapping against the hot pavement. The payphone was just a few blocks away, but it felt like miles. Sweat poured down his face as he sprinted, dodging pedestrians who barely noticed the urgency in his movements. Reaching the phone, Andrew yanked the receiver off the hook and punched in 911. His hands shook as he waited for the operator to pick up. 911, what's your emergency?" "There's a pregnant lady. She collapsed on the sidewalk. She needs help right now," Andrew said, breathless. He gave the location, stumbling over his words in his haste. "An ambulance is on the way," the operator assured him. Andrew didn't wait for a response. Slamming the receiver back onto the cradle, he turned and ran back toward Laura. When he returned, Laura's condition had worsened. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes half closed. "The ambulance is coming," Andrew said, kneeling beside her. "Just hang on, okay?" He took her hand, holding it tightly, as if his presence alone could will her to stay conscious. The minutes dragged on, each second feeling like an eternity. Andrew wiped her forehead with his sleeve, murmuring words of encouragement. Finally, the wail of sirens pierced the air. A paramedic team rushed toward them, carrying equipment and a stretcher. Andrew scrambled to his feet, quickly explaining what had happened. "She's pregnant and she collapsed," he said, his voice steady despite the panic in his chest. "She needs water and she's been in the sun too long." The paramedics nodded, working swiftly to assess Laura's condition. They placed her on the stretcher, securing her with practiced efficiency. "Are you family?" one of them asked Andrew. He shook his head. "No, but I found her. I stayed with her." The paramedic gave him a small, approving nod. "You did good, kid. She's lucky you were here." As the ambulance doors closed, Andrew stood frozen for a moment, his chest heaving from exertion. Then, as the vehicle pulled away, he made his decision. Despite the exhaustion gripping his body, Andrew began to run, following the flashing lights and the sound of the sirens. The hospital was a world away from the streets Andrew knew. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the faint smell of antiseptic. Fluorescent lights hummed softly, casting a sterile glow over the polished floors and pristine walls. Andrew sat alone, in a hard plastic chair, in the corner of the waiting room, his knees pulled up to his chest. His tattered sneakers and dirt-streaked face stood out starkly against the clean, orderly environment. He felt small and out of place, an intruder in a space meant for people with homes, families, and somewhere to belong. Doctors and nurses moved, purposefully, their crisp uniforms spotless. Families spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting toward the doors that led to the emergency unit. Andrew kept his head down, but his ears stayed alert. Every distant footstep, every muffled announcement over the intercom sent a jolt of nervous energy through him. He wiped his hands on his jeans, trying to steady himself. The paramedics had assured him that Laura, the woman he had helped, was in good hands now. But what if he hadn't done enough? What if she didn't make it? The thought churned in his stomach like a heavy stone. The sound of hurried footsteps broke through his thoughts. A man stormed into the waiting room, tall and imposing in an expensive suit that looked out of place in its current state. Tie askew, shirt wrinkled. His face was pale, his eyes wild with panic. Andrew recognized him immediately. He had seen faces like this on billboards and magazine covers. This was Richard Hansen, the billionaire businessman. "Laura Hansen," the man said urgently to the nurse at the desk. His voice was firm, but it trembled at the edges. "My wife, where is she? Is she okay?" "Mr. Hansen," the nurse said gently, "she's stable. The doctors are with her now. She's in the intensive care unit." Richard exhaled sharply, the weight of her words momentarily lifting from his shoulders. He nodded, his relief palpable, and followed the nurse down the hall. Andrew watched him go, his chest tightening. He suddenly felt like an outsider in this man's story. Laura had a family. She had people to care for her now. Maybe he should leave, but before Andrew could make up his mind, Richard returned, his steps slower this time, his expression soft but unreadable. His gaze swept across the waiting room until it landed on Andrew. Richard paused, his brow furrowing slightly as he walked over. "You—" Richard began, his voice hesitant. "Were you with my wife when she collapsed?" Andrew nodded, standing. Up from the chair, his small frame dwarfed by the towering man before him. "Yes, sir. I saw her on the sidewalk and called for help." Richard stared at him for a moment, taking in the boy's thin, wiry build, the grime smudged across his face, the torn clothes. "You saved her," Richard said, his voice quiet but heavy with emotion. "The doctors said, if help hadn't come when it did—" He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Andrew shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to respond. "She needed help," he said, simply shrugging. "I just did what anyone would have done." "Not anyone," Richard said, his tone sharpening. He sat down on a bench nearby and motioned for Andrew to join him. The boy hesitated, then sat at the far edge of the bench, fidgeting with the frayed hem of his shirt. "Why?" Richard asked after a moment. "Why would you help her? You don't even know her." Andrew looked up, his dark eyes meeting Richard's. "Because she needed someone," he said firmly, "and nobody else was stopping." Richard's jaw tightened, his gaze dropping to the floor. "You're right," he admitted, more to himself than to Andrew. "They didn't." Andrew leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "It happens all the time," he said quietly. "People don't. Look at us. It's like we're not even there." Richard stared at him, the boy's words hitting him like a punch to the gut. He had spent his life surrounded by people who sought his attention, who wanted his time, his approval, his money. Yet here was a child, invisible to the world, speaking with a clarity that left him speechless. The nurse returned, interrupting their conversation. "Mr. Hanson," she said softly, "your wife is awake and asking for you. The baby is stable as well." Richard stood abruptly, his relief visible as he exhaled deeply. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He turned back to Andrew. "Don't leave. I'll be back." Andrew nodded, unsure of why he stayed. His instinct was to run, to slip back into the anonymity of the streets. But something about Richard's words, his gratitude, made Andrew stay put. Richard returned not long after, his shoulders less tense, but his expression still serious. He sat beside Andrew again, this time closer. "The doctors told me everything," he said. "They said you stayed with her, gave her water, called for help. You saved her life and my child's." Andrew looked down at his sneakers, uncomfortable with the praise. "I didn't do it for a reward," he muttered. "I know," Richard said. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek leather wallet. "But I can't just let this go unacknowledged. Tell me what you need. Money, food, a place to stay, whatever it is, it's yours." Andrew stiffened, his hands curling into fists. He took a deep breath before replying. "I don't want your money," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I just want people to stop ignoring kids like me, that's all." Richard froze, the boy's words cutting through him like a blade. He had expected gratitude, maybe even awe, but not this. Andrew's gaze didn't waver, his expression as unwavering as his words. Richard exhaled slowly, the weight of what Andrew had said settling over him. "You're right," Richard said finally, his voice low. "I've spent my life looking past people like you, but not anymore." Andrew didn't respond, but for the first time in a long while, he felt truly seen. He stood, brushing off his pants. "I should go," he said. "Wait," Richard said. He didn't reach for the boy, didn't try to stop him. Instead, he watched as Andrew walked away, disappearing into the streets outside. The steady rhythm of the hospital's monitors was a strange kind of comfort for Laura. She lay in the hospital bed, propped up by pillows, her hands resting protectively over her belly. The doctor had assured her that both she and the baby were stable, but her mind kept drifting back to the boy who had saved her, Andrew. She remembered his small hands offering her water, his calm voice telling her she'd be okay. She hadn't even had the chance to thank him. Closing her eyes, she pictured his face, the determination in his eyes, the dirt streaked across his cheeks, and wondered what kind of life he returned to after she was rushed away. "Richard," she said softly, breaking the silence of the room. Her husband was seated nearby, his phone in hand, scrolling through emails. "Yes?" He looked up, his expression softening when he saw her face. "We need to find him," Laura said firmly. "The boy who helped me. I can't stop thinking about him." Richard leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "I've been thinking about that too," he admitted. "I've already reached out to a social worker I know. Her name's Sandra. She might be able to help us find him." Laura nodded, relief washing over her. "Good. He doesn't deserve to be forgotten." Meanwhile, across the city, Andrew was back in the familiar chaos of the streets. He sat on the cracked steps of an abandoned building, surrounded by his makeshift family. Charlie, the wiry veteran, puffed on a cigarette, the smoke curling lazily in the hot air. Miss Maggie fanned herself with a torn piece of cardboard, her face flushed from the relentless heat. "You're a real hero now, huh?" teased Danny, the teen who had taken Andrew under his wing. His grin was crooked but genuine. Andrew shrugged, staring at the ground. "I just did what anyone would have done." "Anyone?" Maggie scoffed. "I've seen plenty of anyones walk right past people in need. You're different, kid." Andrew didn't respond. He didn't tell them the full story about Laura's collapse, the ambulance, or the hospital. He didn't want them to know about the man in the suit or the moment he'd been offered help and turned it down. It all felt too big, too far, removed from their world. "Anyway," Andrew said, standing and brushing off his jeans, "it's over now, let's just forget it." But even as he spoke, he knew he couldn't forget. Richard wasn't the type to leave things unfinished. He had spent his life building empires, solving problems with precision and efficiency. Finding Andrew, however, was proving to be more challenging than he anticipated. "Homeless children are harder to track than you think," Sandra explained, sitting across from him in his office. She was a seasoned social worker with tired eyes, but a determined demeanor. They move constantly, often to avoid the system, and most of them don't trust adults, especially ones with money. Richard frowned. "I just want to help him," he said. "Isn't there something we can do?" Sandra leaned forward. "If you want to help Andrew, you need to understand the world he comes from. He's not just a kid in need of charity. He's surviving in a system that's failed him at every turn." Her words stayed with Richard as he began to dig deeper. He read reports, statistics, and personal stories about homeless youth. The numbers were staggering. Thousands of children like Andrew, invisible to society, slipping through the cracks. Each article, each photograph felt like a punch to the gut. While Richard immersed himself in research, Laura decided to take a different approach. She wanted to see the reality of homelessness for herself. With Sandra as her guide, Laura visited a local shelter. The moment she stepped inside, the air seemed to grow heavier. The room was crowded, filled with people of all ages. A young mother rocked a crying baby in one corner, while an elderly man with a weathered face stared blankly at the wall. The smell of unwashed bodies and despair was suffocating. Laura's chest tightened as she took it all in. She couldn't reconcile this place with the clean, orderly world she had always known. She spoke with a teenage girl who had been living on the streets since she was 12, and with a father who had lost everything after a medical crisis. Their stories were raw and painful, and they ignited something in Laura, a fierce determination to make a difference. "I had no idea," Laura said to Sandra as they left the shelter. "How can this be happening, right in the middle of our city?" Sandra gave her a sad smile. "Because most people don't want to see it." Laura clenched her fists. "I want to see it. I want to do something about it." That evening, Richard and Laura sat together in their home, the weight of what they'd learned hanging between them. "We have to find him," Laura said, her voice unwavering. "Not just for what he did for us, but because he deserves more than this." Richard nodded. "We will," he promised. "And when we do, we're not just going to help him, we're going to change the way we think, the way we live. It's time we did more." As they made their plans, a sense of purpose filled the room. Andrew had touched their lives in ways they couldn't yet fully understand, and they were determined to give that gift back. The sun was beginning to dip below the skyline, casting long shadows across the crumbling buildings and trash-strewn alleys. Richard's polished black shoes crunched against the uneven pavement as he followed Sandra through the narrow streets. He felt out of place here, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the worn-out clothes and wary eyes of the people around him. "Are you sure this is the right place?" Richard asked, his voice low. Sandra nodded, her expression firm. "This is where Andrew and his group usually stay, but don't expect a warm welcome." Richard adjusted his tie, though the gesture felt futile in the oppressive heat. "I just want to talk to him," he said. "You'll need to prove that first," Sandra replied, glancing over her shoulder. "These kids don't trust easily. They've been burned too many times." As they rounded a corner, Richard spotted a small group gathered outside an abandoned building. Andrew was there, seated on the steps with Danny and Miss Maggie. Charlie leaned against the wall, puffing on a cigarette, his sharp eyes darting toward the newcomers. "Andrew," Sandra called out, her tone calm but firm. Andrew's head snapped up. His eyes widened slightly when he saw Richard, but his expression quickly hardened. Danny stood, positioning himself between Andrew and the strangers. "What do you want?" Danny demanded, his voice sharp. Sandra stepped forward, her hands raised, in a placating gesture. "We're here to talk to Andrew, that's all." "Talk about what?" Danny crossed his arms, his stance protective. "He doesn't need anything from you." Richard took a deep breath, stepping closer. "I just want to thank him," he said, his voice steady, "and offer him a chance. A real chance." Andrew stood, brushing off his jeans. "I don't need anything," he said, his tone clipped. "I'm fine right here." The tension in the air was palpable. Sandra glanced at Richard, silently urging him to tread carefully. "Andrew," Richard began, his voice softer now, "you saved my wife and my child. I owe you everything. The least I can do is make sure you're okay." Andrew's jaw tightened. "I said I'm fine." Richard hesitated, unsure of how to break through the boy's defenses. Sandra stepped in, her tone gentle but firm. "Andrew, I know it's hard to trust people, especially people like us, but they're not here to hurt you. They're here because they care." Andrew's eyes flicked to Sandra, then back to Richard. His expression was guarded, but something in his stance shifted, just slightly. At that moment, Laura appeared from behind the group, her movements careful but determined. She approached Andrew slowly, her hands clasped in front of her. "Andrew," she said softly, "it's me." Andrew froze. He hadn't expected to see her again. She looked different now, stronger, more composed. But the gratitude in her eyes was unmistakable. "I've been wanting to thank you," Laura continued, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved my life and my baby's life. I don't know how to put into words how much that means to me." Andrew shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping to the ground. "I just did what anyone would have done," he mumbled. "No," Laura said firmly, stepping closer. "Not anyone. Most people walked past me that day. You didn't. You stayed. You cared." Andrew glanced up, meeting her eyes for the first time. The sincerity in her voice chipped away at the walls he had built around himself. The group watched, in silence, as Laura reached into her bag and pulled out a small bundle. It was the same tattered shirt Andrew had used to shield her from the sun. She had kept it, folded neatly, as a reminder of what he had done. "I thought you might want this back," she said, holding it out to him. Andrew hesitated, then took the shirt from her hands. He ran his fingers over the worn fabric, his expression unreadable. "Thanks," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. Laura smiled gently. "No, Andrew. Thank you." The tension began to ease as Andrew's companions exchanged uncertain glances. Danny lowered his arms, his protective stance softening. Miss Maggie wiped at her eyes, pretending it was just the dust. Even Charlie gave a small nod of approval. Richard stepped forward again, his tone careful. "We're not here to take you away from your friends, Andrew, but we want to give you options, choices. You deserve more than this." Andrew looked at the group around him, the people who had become his family. He thought about the nights, spent huddled together for warmth, the shared meals of stale bread, the laughter that somehow found its way through the cracks of their broken lives. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice heavy with uncertainty. "I don't know if I can trust you." Richard nodded, his expression earnest. "That's okay," he said. "Take your time. We'll be here when you're ready." The aroma of roasted chicken and freshly baked bread wafted through the air as Andrew sat stiffly at the edge of a long oak dining table. The polished surface gleamed under the soft light of an elegant chandelier, its sparkle a stark contrast to Andrew's tattered clothes and nervous demeanor. He felt out of place, like a speck of dirt on something pristine. Laura sat across from him, her eyes warm and inviting. She had gone out of her way to make the evening comfortable, dressing casually and ensuring the meal was simple yet hearty. Richard, seated at the head of the table, glanced at Andrew with an encouraging smile. "Dig in," Laura said softly, gesturing to the spread of food. "There's plenty." Andrew hesitated, his eyes darting between the roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, and rolls. He couldn't remember the last time he'd sat at a table like this, or eaten a meal that didn't come from a trash bin or a handout line. Slowly, he reached for a piece of bread, his hands shaking slightly. The first few minutes passed in silence, the clink of cutlery, the only sound. Andrew ate cautiously, stealing glances around the room. The paintings on the walls, the spotless furniture, the soft rug beneath his feet. It was a world so far removed from the streets that it felt surreal. "This house is huge," Andrew muttered, breaking the silence. Laura chuckled. "It can feel that way sometimes, but it's just a house. What makes it a home is the people in it." Andrew glanced up at her, unsure how to respond. Her words were kind, but they didn't land right. A home wasn't something he could even imagine anymore. As dinner continued, Richard asked gently, "Andrew, have you thought about what you'd like to do? What kind of future you'd want for yourself?" Andrew paused, his fork hovering over his plate. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've never really thought about the future. It's hard to when you're just trying to get through the day." Richard nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's understandable," he said. "But if you could choose anything at all, what would it be?" Andrew shrugged, his shoulders stiffening. "I don't know. I'm fine where I am." Laura leaned forward, her voice soft but firm. "Andrew, you deserve more than just fine. You deserve a life where you can dream, where you can feel safe." Andrew's jaw tightened. He pushed his plate away, suddenly feeling exposed. "It's not that simple," he said quietly. "There are people who depend on me." The atmosphere grew tense as Andrew's words hung in the air. Richard and Laura exchanged a glance, understanding the weight of what he meant. "Your friends on the street," Laura said gently. "They're like family to you, aren't they?" Andrew nodded. "Yeah, they're all I've got. I can't." "Just leave them behind." Richard leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed. "What if we didn't ask you to leave them behind? What if we found a way to help all of you?" Andrew looked up, startled. "All of us? Why not?" "Laura said with a smile, "You've been looking out for each other. Maybe it's time someone looked out for all of you." The next morning, Richard returned to his office, his mind buzzing with ideas. He had spent his life building businesses, crafting strategies, and navigating complex negotiations. But this, helping homeless youth, was a challenge unlike any other. He sat at his desk, staring at a proposal he had drafted overnight. It outlined a pilot program to provide housing, education, and job training for homeless teens. He was eager to present it to his board of directors, but he knew the pushback would be significant. "You want to redirect company funds to—" "What?" one board member had asked during an earlier discussion, her tone incredulous. "To invest in people," Richard had replied firmly. "People like Andrew, who've been overlooked for far too long." The resistance was strong, but Richard didn't waver. For the first time in his life, he felt he was fighting for something that truly mattered. Meanwhile, Andrew returned to his usual spot outside the abandoned building, his thoughts tangled. The dinner at the Hanson home had stirred something in him, a flicker of possibility, a glimpse of a life he'd long since stopped imagining. But the weight of his loyalty to his street family held him back. He spotted Danny and Miss Maggie, sharing a stale loaf of bread. Charlie was sitting nearby, lighting another cigarette. They were his family, his anchors in a chaotic world. Andrew took a deep breath and approached Sandra, who had just arrived to check on the group. "There are other kids," Andrew said hesitantly. "Kids like us out there. If you could, maybe, help them too." Sandra raised an eyebrow, surprised but intrigued. "You want to help them?" Andrew nodded. "Yeah, they need someone to care." As Andrew clutched the tattered shirt in his hand, the smallest spark of hope flickered in his chest. A hope not just for himself, but for those he had left behind on the streets. For the first time, he wasn't just surviving. He was beginning to believe in the possibility of something more. If this moment moved you, don't forget to subscribe and stay with us as Andrew's story continues. The journey is far from over. The city sweltered under a relentless sun, the kind of heat that seemed to suffocate every breath. The sidewalks radiated warmth, shimmering waves distorting the air. For the homeless, the heat wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Andrew wiped the sweat from his brow as he sat on the steps of the abandoned building, staring at the few water bottles the group had managed to scrounge. It wasn't enough. Miss Maggie sat nearby, fanning herself with a piece of cardboard, her face pale and drawn. "This heat's going to take one of us out," she muttered, her voice hoarse. "Not if I can help it," Andrew replied firmly, standing up. He had spent the past few days running between shelters and public fountains, scavenging what he could for the group. But the shelters were overcrowded, and the water fountains ran dry more often than not. "You can't do it all, kid," Charlie said, his usual gruffness softened by concern. "You've got to look after yourself, too." Andrew didn't respond. Looking after himself had never been enough. Across the city, Richard was locked in a tense meeting with his company's board of directors. The air in the conference room was cool, but the atmosphere was heated. "We've seen the numbers, Richard," one board member said sharply. "This new initiative of yours is bleeding resources. You're neglecting the company's core objectives." Richard leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly on the table. "It's not neglect," he replied evenly. "It's an investment in people, in communities. This isn't just about numbers, it's about doing what's right." "And what about the shareholders?" another member shot back. "They didn't sign up for charity work. They invested in a business." Richard felt the familiar pull of frustration and resolve. He had spent years building this company, But for the first time, his vision extended beyond profit margins. "If we're not using our success to make a difference," he said quietly, "then what's the point?" The room fell silent, but Richard could feel the tension simmering beneath the surface. He knew he was risking his position, his reputation, but the image of Andrew and the countless others like him was burned into his mind. Meanwhile, Laura sat in the shaded corner of their living room, her hands resting on her swollen belly. She had tried to stay calm, but the faint, irregular pains over the past few days had been growing stronger. She didn't want to worry Richard, not with everything he was already facing, but she couldn't ignore the fear creeping into her heart. Sandra had visited earlier, bringing her usual steady presence. They had talked about Andrew, about the challenges of building trust, and about the small breakthroughs they had seen. "Andrew's carrying a lot more than most kids his age," Sandra had said, her voice heavy with meaning. "He's protecting himself, but he's also carrying the weight of the people he cares about. That's not something you let go of easily." Laura had nodded, her thoughts drifting to the young boy who had risked so much to help her. "We just have to show him he's not alone," she had said. Now, as another sharp twinge ran through her, Laura closed her eyes and whispered a silent prayer. For herself, for her baby, and for Andrew. Back on the streets, Andrew paced the cracked pavement, his mind racing. The heat had turned every corner of the city into a furnace, and the shelters were turning people away. His group needed more water, more supplies, but more than that, they needed safety. Danny approached him, a rare frown on his face. "There's a spot opening up at the shelter," he said. "They can take one of us, maybe two." Andrew's stomach twisted. Who would he choose? Miss Maggie, whose health was failing. Charlie, who was too stubborn to admit he needed help. Danny, who was strong but still just a kid. "Take it," Andrew said finally, his voice tight. "You and Maggie go." "What about you?" Danny asked, his frown deepening. "I'll figure something out," Andrew replied, brushing him off. But as he watched them walk away, guilt gnawed at him. That evening, Sandra found Andrew sitting alone on the steps, his head in his hands. She sat beside him, waiting for him to speak. "I'm just trying to keep everyone together," Andrew said eventually, his voice low. "But it's like, no matter what I do, it's never enough." Sandra placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "It's not your job to fix everything, Andrew," she said softly. "You're just a kid." Andrew shook his head. "I can't leave them. They're all I've got." "You don't have to leave them," Sandra said. "But maybe it's time to let someone help you too." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the suffocating heat began to ease, but the tension in Andrew's chest remained. He looked out at the city, the lights flickering like distant stars, and felt the weight of the choices before him. The early morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Richard's office, casting long shadows across the polished mahogany desk. Richard stood by the window, staring out at the city skyline, his thoughts far from the business, deals, and board meetings that had once defined his life. Today he wasn't thinking about profits, he was thinking about people. A press conference had been scheduled for later that afternoon. Richard had decided it was time to publicly announce his new initiative for supporting homeless youth. He knew the risks: backlash from his board, skepticism from the media, and potential damage to his company's reputation. But the image of Andrew's determined eyes and his simple, heartfelt plea, "I just want people to stop ignoring kids like me," was etched in his mind. At home, Laura was busy drafting her own speech. Sitting at the kitchen table, she reviewed notes on homelessness, statistics, personal stories she had heard at the shelters, and Andrew's impact on her life. Her determination to make a difference burned brighter than ever. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Richard asked as he walked into the room. Laura looked up, her expression resolute. "I have to be. It's not about me. It's about them." Richard nodded, admiration flickering in his eyes. "We're doing this together." Andrew, meanwhile, sat on the steps of the abandoned building, watching the city come to life around him. The noise of traffic, the chatter of pedestrians, the distant hum of construction, it all felt overwhelming. For weeks, he'd been balancing on a knife's edge, torn between two worlds, the familiarity of his street family and the possibilities Richard and Laura were offering. Danny sat beside him, tossing a small rock between his hands. "So, what's the plan, boss?" Andrew shrugged, staring at the cracked pavement. "I don't know, man. It's not like I have a lot of options." Danny raised an eyebrow. "You've got more options than most of us. Don't waste it." Andrew shot him. "Look, and what about you guys? What happens if I leave?" Danny sighed. "We survive like we always do. But maybe if you go, you can do something bigger, something that helps all of us." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Later. That day, the press conference unfolded in a sleek, modern auditorium filled with reporters, cameras, and curious onlookers. Richard took the stage, his presence commanding as always, but this time his message was different. "For too long, we've focused solely on profit," Richard began, his voice steady and clear. "But success means nothing if we don't use it to uplift those who need it most. Today, I'm proud to announce the launch of the Hanson Initiative for Homeless Youth, a program dedicated to providing shelter, education, and opportunities for the most vulnerable among us." The room buzzed with murmurs and whispers as reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. Richard continued, addressing the inevitable criticism head-on. "I understand that some will question this decision, wondering why a business leader would take such a stand. But I believe that wealth and power come with responsibility, and if that means taking risks, then so be it." Meanwhile, Laura had joined a panel discussion on a popular morning show. She spoke with grace and passion, sharing her personal experience with Andrew and the stories of others she had met during her visits to shelters. "Homelessness isn't just a statistic," Laura said, her voice steady but emotional. "It's children like Andrew who are fighting battles we can't even imagine. It's families torn apart by circumstances beyond their control. We can't look away anymore." Her words struck a chord, and the audience responded with applause. But while the Hansons' efforts were gaining traction, Andrew's street family faced a new crisis. The owner of the abandoned building they had called home had decided to sell the property, and they were given 48 hours to leave. "They're kicking us out," Miss Maggie said, her voice trembling. "Where are we supposed to go?" Andrew clenched, his fists, his mind racing. He had always been the one to find solutions, to figure out how to keep everyone safe, but this time it felt impossible. "You don't have to do this alone," Sandra said, appearing at his side. "Let me help." Andrew hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to protect his family on his own. But the weight of their situation and the trust he had begun to build with Sandra, Richard, and Laura pushed him toward a different decision. That evening, as the city settled into dusk, Andrew stood outside the Hanson home, clutching the folded shirt Laura had returned to him. He had made his choice. Richard opened the door, his expression unreadable for a moment before breaking into a warm smile. "Andrew," he said, stepping aside, "come in." The grand opening of the Hanson Initiative for Homeless Youth was a far cry from the sterile corporate events Richard had hosted in the past. Instead of suits and ties, the room was filled with casual chatter, bright smiles, and a sense of hope. The initiative's newly renovated facility stood as a symbol of transformation, a space where kids like Andrew could find shelter, education, and a chance to rebuild their lives. Andrew stood near the back of the crowd, his hands shoved into the pockets of his new jacket. He still wasn't used to being the center of attention. Sandra was at his side, her encouraging smile steady as always. "You're a big part of why we're here today," she said. Andrew shrugged, his gaze fixed on Richard, who was addressing The crowd from a small podium. This isn't just a program, Richard was saying. It's a promise, a commitment to ensure no child feels invisible or unwanted. These kids aren't problems to be solved. They're people with potential waiting to be unlocked. And it starts here, today. The crowd erupted in applause, but Andrew barely heard it. His mind was already racing with ideas, ways to improve the program, ways to make it truly useful. Inside the facility, Andrew wandered through the brightly lit halls. The classrooms, dormitories, and community spaces were nothing like the cold, impersonal shelters he'd known. He ran his hand along the wall, pausing in a room filled with art supplies. A small smile tugged at his lips. "What do you think?" Richard's voice startled him. Andrew turned to see the older man standing in the doorway, his expression warm but curious. "It's nice," Andrew said, his voice quiet. "But it could be better." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Better how?" Andrew hesitated, then gestured toward the room. "It's good for kids starting over, but what about the ones who've been out there a long time? They need more than art supplies. They need, I don't know, stuff that helps them feel normal again." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "Like what?" Andrew bit his lip, thinking. "Maybe a place where they can just talk. Like, really talk. About what they've been through. And someone who actually listens." Richard smiled. "That's a good idea. Why don't we make it happen?" A few days later, Andrew found himself at a roundtable meeting with program coordinators and social workers. At first, he'd been nervous, feeling out of place among the polished professionals. But as the discussion went on, he realized that his voice mattered. "They'll tell you they're fine," Andrew said, leaning forward. "But they're not. You have to look past that. Don't push too hard, but don't let them hide either." One of the coordinators nodded, jotting down notes. "That's really helpful, Andrew. Thank you." By the end of the meeting, Andrew felt something he hadn't in a long time: purpose. Meanwhile, at the Hanson home, the atmosphere was filled with anticipation. Laura was due any day now, and Richard had taken a rare break from work to be with her. The nursery was ready, a soft, serene space painted in calming shades of green and white. "You're going to be a great dad," Laura said one evening, resting her hand on his. Richard smiled, his gaze softening. "And you're going to be an amazing mom." When the time finally came, it was late at night. Laura clutched Richard's hand as they rushed to the hospital, the tension in the air palpable. Hours later, their baby's first cry filled the delivery room. "She's beautiful," Laura whispered, tears streaming down her face as she held their daughter for the first time. Richard kissed her forehead, his own eyes glistening. "She's perfect." Back at the shelter, Andrew stood outside, his breath visible in the crisp evening air. He watched as Miss Maggie and Danny walked into the building, their steps hesitant but hopeful. Charlie had taken a little more convincing, but he had finally agreed to give the program a chance too. "They're going to be okay," Sandra said. Standing beside him, Andrew nodded, his chest tightening. "Yeah, I think so." But as he watched them disappear into the warmth of the facility, he couldn't help feeling a pang of sadness. For so long they had been his family, his constant in a world of chaos. Letting them go, even for something better, wasn't easy. Later that evening, Andrew returned to the Hanson home. He sat in the living room, absently running his fingers over the folded shirt Laura had given back to him. The sound of soft footsteps drew his attention, and Laura entered, cradling her newborn in her arms. "Do you want to meet her?" Laura asked, her voice gentle. Andrew hesitated, then nodded. Laura carefully handed him the baby, her trust in him clear. Andrew looked down at the tiny face, her soft breaths warming his hands. "What's her name?" he asked. "Hope," Laura said with a smile. "Because that's what she brought us." Andrew's throat tightened, and he looked up at Laura. "She's lucky to have you," he said quietly. Laura placed a hand on his shoulder. And we're lucky to have you, Andrew. The crisp morning air carried the faint scent of fresh paint and newly planted flowers. The community centre, the heart of Richard and Laura's homeless youth initiative, stood gleaming in the sunlight. A banner above the entrance read, "Hope for all, a new beginning." Volunteers bustled about, setting up tables, arranging chairs, and placing welcome signs as the grand opening drew near. Andrew lingered at the edge of the crowd, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets. He watched as people gathered, their faces filled with curiosity and anticipation. The center wasn't just a building, it was a promise, a tangible sign that someone cared. Laura approached him, her warm smile as inviting as ever. In her arms, she held baby Hope, who cooed softly, oblivious to the commotion around her. "Nervous?" Laura asked gently. Andrew shrugged, kicking at the gravel beneath his feet. "A little. It's a lot." Laura placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's okay to feel that way. This place exists because of kids like you. You helped make it happen." Andrew didn't respond, but her words settled in his chest like a weight, not heavy, but grounding. Inside, the ceremony began with a speech from Richard. He stood tall at the podium, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "This center represents more than just walls and a roof," he said. "It's a testament to the power of community, of compassion, and of second chances." But none of this would have been possible without the stories that inspired it. Stories like Andrew's. Richard gestured toward Andrew, who shifted uncomfortably as all eyes turned to him. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Andrew barely heard it. His focus was on the words Richard had just spoken. His story mattered. Later that afternoon, as the formalities wound down, Andrew found himself surrounded by familiar faces. Danny, Miss Maggie, and even Charlie had come to celebrate. They laughed and reminisced, their voices carrying a warmth that felt like home. "You did good, kid," Charlie said, clapping Andrew on the back. "Real good." Andrew smiled, a rare and genuine expression. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel the pride bubbling in his chest. Meanwhile, Laura sat in a quiet corner of the center, reviewing plans for her foundation. The initiative was no longer just an idea, it was becoming a movement. Donations were pouring in, volunteers were signing up, and local businesses were stepping forward to contribute. Sandra approached her, a cup of coffee in hand. "You've done something incredible here, Laura." Laura looked up, her eyes shining. "We've done something incredible. This was never just about me or Richard. It's about all of us." Sandra nodded, her gaze drifting to the bustling center. "You've given these kids something they've never had before, hope." At the Hanson home, the adoption process was quietly moving forward. Papers had been signed, home visits completed, and now it was just a matter of waiting. Andrew hadn't said much about it, but Laura and Richard could sense the quiet shift in him. He lingered longer at the dinner table, joined conversations more readily, and even helped with small chores around the house. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Laura brought up the topic. "Andrew," she began, her tone careful, "how are you feeling about everything?" Andrew hesitated, fiddling with the hem of his shirt. "It's weird," he admitted. "Good weird, I guess. But it's scary too." Richard leaned forward, his voice steady. "You don't have to decide anything right now. We just want you to know that this is your home for as long as you want it to be." Andrew looked at them, his gaze searching. "You really mean that?" "Of course we do," Laura said, her voice soft but firm. For the first time, Andrew let himself believe it. As the day of the adoption announcement approached, Richard's company unveiled a bold new mission statement, integrating social responsibility into its core values. The move was met with mixed reactions at first, but as the initiative's impact became clearer, public opinion began to shift. Shareholders who had initially expressed skepticism began to see the value, not just in financial terms, but in the way it transformed the company's image and purpose. Richard, once focused solely on profit, now found himself energized by this new direction. "This is just the beginning," he said to his board during a meeting. "We're not just building a business anymore, we're building a legacy." The chapter concludes with a quiet celebration at the Hanson home. Andrew sits by the fireplace, baby Hope asleep in his arms. Laura watches from across the room, her heart swelling with pride and love. Richard joins her, placing an arm around her shoulders. "He's settling in," Richard said softly. Laura nodded. "He's starting to believe he belongs." The fire crackled softly as Andrew looked down at Hope, her tiny hand clutching his finger. For the first time in a long time, he felt not just hope, but home. The warm rays of the summer sun bathed the city in golden light as laughter echoed through the halls of the community center. It had been 1 year since the Hanson Initiative for Homeless Youth had opened its doors, and today was a day of celebration. Children ran through the halls, their laughter mingling with the hum of conversations from volunteers and staff. The once empty building now bustled with life, a beacon of hope for those who had once been forgotten. Andrew stood in the middle of it all, his presence calm yet commanding. He wore a simple button-down shirt, the sleeves rolled up as he guided a group of teenagers through a discussion on setting goals and building trust. His voice carried a quiet authority, the kind that came from lived experience rather than instruction. "You're not defined by where you came from," Andrew said, looking each of them in the eye, "but by where you choose to go next." The teens nodded, their expressions a mix of hope and determination. For many of them, Andrew wasn't just a mentor, he was proof that change was possible. Richard watched from a distance, his hands tucked into the pockets of his tailored slacks. He marveled at how far Andrew had come. The boy who had once been hesitant to trust anyone now stood as a leader, inspiring others with his resilience and wisdom. "It's incredible, isn't it?" Laura said as she approached. Baby Hope nestled in her arms. The toddler clutched a small stuffed bear, her bright eyes scanning the lively scene. Richard nodded, his voice soft. "He's made this place his own. And so have you," Laura added, placing a hand on his arm. "This wouldn't have been possible without you taking that first step." Richard smiled, though his expression carried a hint of introspection. "You know," he said, "I used to think success was about building something big, something people couldn't ignore. But now I realize it's about building something that makes a difference." The impact of their work was undeniable. Laura's foundation had grown beyond their initial expectations, partnering with organizations across the country to replicate their model. Communities that had once turned a blind eye to homelessness were now rallying together, inspired by the Hansons' efforts. As Richard and Laura walked through the center, they were greeted by smiles and waves. Parents thanked them for giving their children a chance at a better future. Volunteers shared stories of lives transformed. Everywhere they turned, they saw evidence of change. Later that afternoon, Andrew found a quiet moment to step outside. The familiar hum of the city filled the air, but it no longer felt overwhelming. Instead, it felt alive, full of stories waiting to be written. He leaned against the railing, lost in thought, when he noticed a young boy sitting on the curb across the street. The boy's clothes were dirty, his face streaked with grime. He clutched a battered backpack to his chest, his wide eyes darting nervously as people walked by without a second glance. Andrew felt a pang in his chest, the scene a mirror of his own past. Without hesitation, he crossed the street and crouched down in front of the boy. "Hey," Andrew said gently. "You okay?" The boy flinched but didn't move. His grip on the backpack tightened. Andrew sat down beside him, giving him space. "You don't have to be scared," he said. I've been where you are. I know it's hard." The boy's eyes flicked toward him, filled with a mixture of curiosity and caution. "You were like me?" he asked softly. Andrew nodded. "Yeah, but someone helped me, and now I want to help you." He extended a hand, the gesture simple but profound. The boy hesitated, then slowly reached out, his small hand slipping into Andrew's. Inside the community center, Richard and Laura stood by the window, watching as Andrew walked back toward the building with the boy at his side. Laura smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "He's become everything we hoped he could be." Richard placed an arm around her shoulders. "And he's just getting started." The story ends with Andrew guiding the boy into the bustling community center, where laughter and hope filled the air. It was a place of second chances, a testament to the power of compassion and resilience. As the door closed behind them, it wasn't just the beginning of the boy's journey, it was the continuation of a legacy. What we learn from the story compassion creates ripples. A single act of kindness can set off a chain reaction, transforming lives and inspiring change in ways unimaginable. Family is built, not born. True family is defined by love, trust, and commitment, not just by blood. Resilience overcomes adversity. No matter how dire the circumstances, hope and perseverance can lead to new beginnings. Wealth and responsibility. True success lies not in accumulation, but in using one's resources to make a meaningful difference. The power of second chances. Everyone deserves an opportunity to rewrite their story, and sometimes all it takes is someone who believes in them. If you love the story, please share us. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. And if this story has touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. Your support helps us continue sharing meaningful stories like this one. Thank you so much for watching and being part of this journey with us. Stay tuned for more stories that inspire, uplift, and remind us of the power of kindness. See you in the next video.